So welcome everyone to our webinar, Closing the Opportunity Gap, the Literacy How Approach. I am Margie Gillis, the founder and president and mentor for Literacy How, our nonprofit organization that provides professional development for teachers on teaching children how to read. I'm also a research affiliate at Haskins Laboratories, where I began this work in 2000. And I want to welcome everyone here who's joining us from the state of Connecticut, where we do most of our work. And thank you for all our partners who work with us. Many of you are joining today. Really appreciate your partnership. And for people that we've worked with outside of the state of Connecticut, thank you for joining. We have registrants from across the country and really enjoy and welcome all of you to this webinar. We also have people from other countries that registered, including folks from Canada, from Bermuda, and from England. So late afternoon, early evening. If you're tuning in from England, it's early in the morning. Welcome all. By way of introducing myself, I just want to give you a brief background. My roots for teaching really are in special education, and I've taught many children and quite a few adults how to read. I am so passionate about this work because we, and you'll learn more about this, we in our country have a crisis, really, a literacy crisis, and has created an opportunity gap that we need to figure out how to address. And so I'm blessed to be able to do this work. I am really so focused on the children because I believe there is no more important thing to teach children than to teach them to read. And last but not least, I am so grateful that I still have opportunities to apply what I've learned over the many years that I've done this work and work in the trenches whenever I can, get into schools, meet with teachers and administrators. And a highlight of this past year that, as everyone knows, has been a challenging year for educators, for everyone really, but in terms of today's presentation, educators have really had to be flexible and think about how they can take a situation that's very challenging and make it work for their students. I had the great good fortune of teaching my oldest granddaughter, Reese, who at the time was 5. I got to teach her how to read. And it was the most exciting thing I've done in a very long time. Just so rewarding. And here she is 9 months later reading chapter books. So it's kept me grounded in reality and really understand how important this work is. I also want to point out that we're talking about an opportunity gap. We often hear about an achievement gap, but I really like the term opportunity gap because it really speaks to the responsibility on an inequitable system that has to be addressed to provide opportunities for all students that they are successful in learning to read. Our mission at Literacy How, as we work with teachers, is to empower them so that every child will learn to read. Our model is based on research, and there's lots of scientific research on this front on how children learn to read. And our approach is values-driven. This is a list of our core values that guide everything we do, again, with the children at the center. And literacy, as I said, is a key to opportunity. If you can't read, really does influence your life in so many ways. And we know what inspires us is that 95% of all children can be taught to read. And we keep that as our goal, as our benchmark. We also focus on teachers because we truly believe that it is the teacher that teaches the child, not the program, not the product. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but teachers really are the key ingredient. So we empower them with the best ways to teach. Now, you might be asking yourself this question: what gap are we talking about here? Well, as I just mentioned, our country does have a literacy crisis that has persisted for quite some time. Our reading scores have been stagnant, and we know this because we've been measuring these scores actually since 1969. Many educators aren't aware of this preponderance of evidence and research on how children learn to read. And what we know from that research is that most children need explicit and sustained instruction in order to become proficient, not just with reading, but with writing as well. And that means that our teachers need explicit and sustained professional development so that they can deliver this instruction. Now, I mentioned that our reading scores have been measured over the past, well, since 1969, so for 50 years, right? And we've been looking at every state since 1992, and we have data based on the nation's report card, otherwise known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This national assessment, this report card, measures what our United States students know, and we measure that knowledge across subject areas, including, in this case, reading. So what you see here is a snapshot of the 2019 data. This assessment is administered to a randomized sample of students in every single state so that we can compare our performance across states. We can also disaggregate the data because we're looking at groups of students with similar characteristics. In this case, we're looking at students based on their race and ethnicity. And what you'll see here is that we're going to see a bar for our white students, our Black, etc. And what you see in red are the percentage of students at or above grade level. So we see that 45% of our white students in 2019 were reading at or above grade level, compared to our Black students, only 18% were reading on grade level, at or above grade level. 23%, so slightly higher number for Hispanics, and 19% for our American Indians. We can see Asian Americans do slightly better with 54%, but the bottom line here is that no one is doing well. When I mentioned that 95% of our children can be taught to read, this is a huge gap between where our performance is presently and what we can expect our students to be able to do. So that's our bar. So for the webinar this afternoon, this evening, I'm going to cover 5 things. I'm going to talk about the Literacy How framework that addresses the core elements of literacy. I am going to talk about what success looks like in the classroom, because that's what we're after. We want our students and our teachers to be successful. I also want to talk about the role that administrators play in this changing the system, because they have a very, very important role. Fourth, I want to talk a little bit about strategies that will help developing and struggling readers, because if we're going to close that gap that I just showed you, we have to focus on the students that are getting further and further behind. And last, I want to talk about this framework within your context. So the first thing I want to talk about is this Literacy How framework, which really describes our approach to professional development. Our approach to professional development is rooted in teaching teachers about how they need to teach their students to read. And we have to teach teachers about that process. And I love this quote from an article that Castles and colleagues wrote called Ending the Reading Wars, that says all writing systems are a kind of code for spoken language, and learning to read requires children to crack how the code works for their particular language. Now, there are 3 categories of writing systems. So English is based on an alphabetic writing system. And an alphabetic writing system means that you have to learn the symbols, the letters of the alphabet, and the sounds that they represent. There's another type of writing system called a syllabic system, where symbols represent whole syllables. An example of that writing system would be Japanese. The third type of writing system that's different from the prior two is called a logographic system, where symbols represent elements of both meaning and sound. An example of this is Chinese. So we must have our teachers understand that alphabetic system and what that means. Before I talk a little bit more about that alphabetic system, I want to introduce you to our content, how we kind of organize and teach teachers about these core components of comprehensive literacy that students need to understand and acquire to become skilled readers. In 2000, when we started this work at Haskins Laboratories, we created our first reading wheel that was based on the findings from the National Reading Panel. The National Reading Panel was a group of experts that met for about a year in the year 1999. They released their report after they analyzed over 100,000 studies that pertain to reading, and they identified 5 big ideas. The 5 big ideas were phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And over the years, as we've taken this research and digested it and made it come alive for teachers, we've added a few things that we felt were missing from that first National Reading Panel report. We added spelling to phonics because those skills of phonics or decoding and encoding or spelling are reciprocal. They're very much related. We added morphology, which is the study of the units of meaning or morphemes, to this vocabulary section of the wheel. And we added written expression to the section that includes comprehension, because comprehension and written expression are also reciprocal skills, and they really do complement and really bootstrap each other. Fluency was taken out of the wheel and replaced with syntax, because we actually teach the important components of fluency as we also teach our teachers and of course our students about the role that syntax and grammar play in comprehension. And then very, very importantly, we have oral language at the core, and you'll learn more tonight about the importance of language as a foundational, very important foundation to learning to read. Many of you have probably heard of the simple view of reading, and this is a formula that has many years of converging evidence to support it, to explain that reading comprehension, RC here, and here's a picture of a child reading a book about elephants. In order to have good reading comprehension, to comprehend what you read, you have to have there are 2 separate components that contribute to good reading comprehension. First is listening or language comprehension, which is the LC in this formula. Listening comprehension is your ability to understand what you hear, not what you're reading, but what you're listening to, okay? And a complementary, different type of skill or component that is also necessary is the ability to decode, to look at a word and sound it out if you don't know what it is and instantly recognize it. And the idea is that you have to have both of these, listening comprehension and decoding. We have a product here because you have to have both in order to be a skilled reader. And they're highly correlated because of that. Now, to expand that idea of the simple view, which is a very important concept here, we have Hollis Scarborough's rope that she developed now almost 20 years ago that takes that idea of the simple view and expands upon it. So we have language comprehension here at the top of the rope, and language comprehension has 5 different strands that are listed here, and each strand contributes to a child's ability to understand language. And language comprehension really has to do with being strategic when you read, and also metacognitive, the ability to think about what you're reading while you're reading. At the bottom of this rope, you have word recognition. Now, in the formula, it was called D, the D standing for decoding. And you can see that one of the strands associated with word recognition is decoding, the ability to sound words out. But in order to do that, we also know that there's a very important role that phonological awareness plays in this process of being able to read words. Phonological awareness, the ability to hear the sounds in the words, to be able to pull them apart, blend them back together, and then also advanced level of phonemic awareness, manipulate those sounds. All of that contributes to automatic word recognition. So this bottom of the rope really looks at automaticity. Very different skills, metacognition versus automaticity. And you need both to be a skilled reader, where you fluently execute and coordinate the word recognition skills and the comprehension skills. Now, I also want to bring your attention to this birth through grade 8 here at the bottom, because this is also an important concept to think about. When children are born, when they come into the world and they're hearing the adults around them and their siblings and other children saying all these words, they're absorbing a lot about language. So they're absorbing some things about language comprehension. They're also hearing phonological information. They're processing that as well. And so at birth, these strands are very separable. As children enter school and kindergarten and begin to have formal education, we are introducing them to some of these word recognition strands, as well as immersing them in rich language through read alouds, etc. And so you'll notice that the strands aren't really woven together until about grade 3, when children go from learning to read to reading to learn. It actually takes most children at least 2 years, and in some cases 3 years, until they get to 2nd grade and some even 3rd grade, before they can do this very complicated thing of lifting words off the page and understanding what all those words mean. The second thing I want to talk about tonight is, what does classroom success look like? We need to know what we're looking for to know that we're making a difference. And so I want to talk about 2 complementary aspects of success. The first is, what are the characteristics of teachers who are successful? Well, first, they have to be knowledgeable. They have to learn a whole lot about language and literacy skills. They also have to be experienced. They have to practice that knowledge and apply that knowledge to become really good at teaching these skills. We also believe that the teachers who are open to learning new methods of instruction are the ones that really have the most success with their students, because they never feel like they know everything. They're never done. And that's the nature of research. Research is continually, evolving and teaching us more and more about what it is that we need to understand to be able to teach children. And lastly, teachers who are invested in every student's success, who truly believe that every student can be successful. Those are the characteristics of successful teachers. Now, complementary to that are our students. Our students, we need to know that they can read and write proficiently. That's our goal. If they're not, then we haven't achieved the success that we're looking for. We also need to see that our students are developing oral language skills. And I said that that was at the center of the reading wheel because that is the foundation to learning to read and write. And the classroom that is a buzz where kids are talking to one another and having fun and interacting, not just with the teacher, but each other, that gives them the opportunities to practice their oral language skills that are so very important. And the last thing that we look for success with students is that they're really engaged. They're having fun, they're engaged, they're persistent, they want to be successful, and they're highly motivated to keep trying, even when it may be challenging. And in order to do all those things, in order to teach those teachers those skills and make sure that the students are successful, we believe it's very, very important to teach about the science of the reading brain. It's a very major understanding because the brain has to actually rewire to learn to read. And why is that? That's because we come into this world with brains that are wired to acquire language. If we're around other adults and if the child is around children who are speaking to them and talking to them, they're absorbing that language so that eventually they will be able to express their thoughts and what they need, etc. That comes for free. We are neurologically wired to speak and to see and to think, but not to read. We do not have the wiring built into the brain at this point in time. What we have to do is rearrange the brain's original parts that are located in the left hemisphere, in the language hemisphere of the brain, to learn how to read. And to do that, to teach that very important skill is actually rocket science. Another great quote that I love from Steven Pinker, a linguist, said, "Children are wired for sound, but print is an optional accessory that must be painstakingly bolted on." I think that really speaks to how important this process is. And our teachers need to hear from us and learn that they actually can change the wiring of the brain. That's something that's super exciting and empowering for them. So this slide shows a pre-intervention picture of a brain where we're not seeing much activation in the frontal, definitely no activation in the temporal parietal region of the brain. These are the regions that I mentioned that are there for language acquisition, but we have to build a circuitry in order to have students reading fluently. Post-intervention, the students are lighting up. The children's brains are lighting up in those areas of the brain that I just talked about. And in fact, the development of automatic word recognition is tied to the brain's reorganization. And that must occur in order for children to learn to read. So you see visible and visual and concrete evidence of this happening, and that's incredibly important and empowering. Earlier, I mentioned that English is a system that is based on the alphabet. And it is true that it is based on the alphabet, and we talk about it being phonemic because that means that students need to learn that they're letters and that those letters correspond to sounds. The sounds that they've been hearing, they've heard those, they know what those sounds are. What they have to learn when they go to school is each sound has a letter that is associated with it. But English is a challenging language because it's not just based on sounds or phonemes, it's also based on meaning or morphemes. So I'll give you an example. If you say the word cat and I ask you to tell me how many sounds you hear in that word, I'll give you a second. You would probably say, k, hopefully anyway, k, at. And if I asked you to tell me the letters for those sounds, you would say C-A-T. Okay, that's where you have one-to-one correspondence between the sound and its corresponding letter. But we have many words in English that are not that simple. For example, if I ask you to tell me how many sounds you hear in the word health, I'll give you a minute. I hope you all are in good health. You would say o. Okay, there are 4 sounds in that word. If I ask you to spell the word health, most of you will spell the word properly, H-E-A-L-T-H. How did you know there was an A in there? How did you know that F sound should be spelled E-A? Well, most of you may not be aware of this, but the word health has the root word heal in it. And because English is based on meaningful units, as I said, and is morphophonemic, that is something that we need to teach and explain to our students. But teachers obviously need to know that first. So the teachers need to understand that there is a structure of English and there are elements that they need to master to be able to explain that structure to their students. How are we going to do this? Very important work. If teaching reading is rocket science, what's the best way to get this information across to teachers? Well, we do it through substantive professional development opportunities. And this slide is somewhat dated now, but I think it still holds true that we have basically four aspects of professional development that we can use to help teachers develop this knowledge and these skills. First is the theory. Second is to demonstrate what that theory actually looks like, so modeling some of that. The third element that's important is to give teachers opportunities to practice what that particular content is related to the theory and the demonstration. And the fourth element that I want to talk more about this evening is coaching. So you have 3 levels here. You have a knowledge level, you have a skill attainment level, and you have a transfer to practice level. And what this shows is that if you're just teaching the theory, you're only going to retain 10% of that theory if that's all you hear about. And your ability to transfer that to the skill related to that theory is even less, 5%. Your transfer to practice to actually be able to instruct that practice and use that practice in a classroom is 0. If you add demonstration as an element for professional development, the knowledge level will increase to 30%. The skill will increase slightly to 20%. More than slightly, it actually helps to have that demonstration, but you still don't have that transfer to practice, which is what we know we need to see when the teacher actually can make it happen in the classroom with his or her students. When you add practice to this structure, you certainly bump up the teacher's knowledge level. So you get to 60% and you actually get to 60% in terms of skill attainment, but you still don't get much transfer because that practice is limited and you don't have feedback that you need to know, am I on the right track with this or not? It's only when you add coaching where teachers receive ongoing support and guidance, and they go back to their classrooms having had the theory, having seen a demonstration, having practiced some of those skills, and now in the classroom I have somebody who's giving me guidance, who's showing me the way. And this, I think, is an incredibly important message to give our administrators, that teachers need substantive professional development opportunities to master this knowledge and these skills. So here is where our Literacy How mentors enter into the story. So the Literacy How mentors who are providing this embedded professional development support to teachers are research to practice experts. They love the research. They read it. They're voracious about consuming it and thinking about what are the implications for classroom instruction. They're detectives for what's going to work for which students and why. They are peer coaches for the teachers. because teachers are adult learners and they learn differently than children do. So they have to understand how to partner with teachers in non-judgmental ways. They also have to model a problem-solving approach to working with students, which includes a gradual release, where they're going to model for a little while and then they're going to co-teach for a little while, and eventually they're going to release the responsibility of teaching to the teachers. We use the professional learning series books for our professional development, both outside of the classroom as well as, as the central focus for our modeling of lessons. And we work with school-based partners to build capacity and ensure sustainability. This is a very important part of the work that we do, because if we spend time in schools and then have to leave a year or two or whenever we leave, if we can't leave behind our good work through those internal coaches and reading interventionists and experts, internal experts, then our work doesn't get to sustain over time. I also want to mention that our mentors, and I want to shout out to all the mentors and my team, because I have an incredible team in addition to the Literacy How mentors, Kristen, Kim, and Leslie, who are joining us this evening and helping facilitate this webinar. In March of last year, when the world just changed forever, we had to change what we were doing, and we held our breath, hoping that we would be able to continue our good work. And I'm very, very happy to say that our districts asked us to continue our work through our virtual professional development, and we have learned a lot about how to leverage technology to do the work that we know is really important. And one of our very best partners over the years has been the Stanford Public Schools system. I actually started working there in 2004 when we received a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, and I added another school in Stanford 2 years later. And here we are in 2021. We're working in all 13 elementary schools. And Amy Beldotti, who's an associate superintendent there, associate superintendent in charge of teaching and learning, gave us this beautiful quote, identifying, or not identifying, but acknowledging the fact that the teachers identified our coaching, our modeling, and the support as the most beneficial professional development they received. So thank you, Stanford, Amy, Dr. Lucero, for trusting in us. There is a science of reading, and I know that many of you have heard about it. There's been quite a buzz in the last year about it. The science of reading is robust. The science of teaching reading isn't quite as robust, in that we know that it's all very, very important to implement the science, but how do we do that? A few weeks ago, I listened to a great podcast, and Daniel Willingham, whom some of you know, and David Daniel, were the two Daniels, talked about the important ingredients for applying the science of reading. And I'd not heard of this before, but I really love this idea of must-haves. So what are must-haves? These are things that we must do to teach children to read. They're not optional, and they actually help rewire the brain. And we talked about that. So I just made a short list. This is not an exhaustive list, but some must-haves for teaching children to read are that we must use explicit and systematic instruction in both phonemic awareness and phonics that is guided by a scope and sequence that acts as a pacing guide, so we know where we're going to go, where we're going to start and where we're going to go. We also know that we have to teach spelling, or encoding and decoding, together because they're reciprocal skills. A third must-have is when students are learning to crack the code, when they've got the alphabetic principle, they understand letters and sounds go together. We have to give them practice to build their accuracy and their automatic word reading skills. And the best way to do that is to use decodable books through those early stages of reading. And when we think about the comprehension side of that equation that we talked about earlier, we want to make sure, and we must actually give extensive reading experiences to our students to build, once they have the word recognition skills, we have to give them experiences so they can build their vocabulary and their background knowledge. Now, on the other side of this slide, we have could do's. So could do's are things that look promising and that will probably help the students get to the must-haves. And just a couple of examples, how teachers find ways to make reading materials both visible and enticing, so students will choose to pick up a book. The more they read, the better they're going to get at reading. Also ensuring that that children see themselves as readers, and this becomes part of their identity. That's also important. That is a could do that will help children get to the must-haves. And last, another example, engaging students in active use of learning vocabulary words. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is the role that administrators play in changing this system so we can address the opportunity gap. And when I talk about administrators here, I'm referring to district level administrators as well as school level administrators, principals and assistant principals. The role that administrators play cannot be underemphasized or too emphasized. In other words, it's really, really important. And I do write a blog for the IDEA Examiner, and the most recent one I wrote was called Administrators Lead the Way, and I lifted this quote out of the blog saying, rarely have I heard of or seen any evidence that a leadership training program that's designed for school administrators includes a course, or better yet, a series of courses that teach the science of reading. In other words, over the many years now, 20 years and counting, that I've worked with schools and districts, it's unfortunate, but I can tell you that most administrators do not have a background in literacy. Some do, but many or most do not. And why is that important? Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that teachers, of course, I've been talking about this, need to know a lot. Well, so do administrators. So I'm just going to give you a few things that I think are important to highlight. First, they need to know stages of reading and spelling development. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. They also need to know how to assess all those components of literacy that I spoke about earlier around the reading wheel. They need to know the structure of the English language, which I also explained. The relationship between oral language as a foundational skill for literacy and literacy. They need to know how to engage and motivate culturally and linguistically diverse learners, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. And lastly, they need to know how to identify risk factors right away, because if we identify those students that are at risk, as soon as we see evidence of it, we can actually start doing some really important preventative and intervention work with those students. Well, why do administrators need to know all of that? Well, the reason is that administrators are the ones who go into teachers' classrooms and evaluate them. Our mentors don't do that. They cannot do that, and they will not do that. They have to develop a peer relationship with them. But the administrators are responsible for seeing how their teachers are doing. And in order to do that, they have to know a lot. Right? We know our children have to have strong literacy skills. They also have to know a lot about the world for comprehension in order to access opportunities. So the administrators need to know what to look for, where we call these observable competencies, right? And the observable competencies are twofold. They're competencies associated with the foundational skills associated with word recognition, and the competencies associated with comprehension, and all those things that were at the top of the rope. They need to know how to observe each of those components. Now, I talked about developing and struggling readers as a fourth element of this webinar that I'd like to talk about. And I want to talk about the fact that our approach teaches teachers, as I said, both sides of the equation, the word recognition skills and the comprehension skills. For students who are developing readers, in other words, they're just learning how to read, they're in kindergarten, first grade, and they're figuring things out, they have to have strong foundational skills. And for students who are struggling, third grade, fifth grade, we work with teachers that are pre-K teachers all the way up through high school. And sadly, many of our high school students have not mastered foundational skills. So some of our focus has to be on teaching these along a continuum. And again, focusing on how children learn to read, whether they're 5 or 15, the answer is the same for all. They all have to learn this code. The emphasis of the instruction will differ depending on where the child is in the developmental progression, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, it takes 2 to 3 years to learn to read. So you have to know, as a student at the beginning of that process, or in the middle of that process of learning to read, or are they getting closer to reading to learn? And so the emphasis of instruction will differ depending on where the child is in that progression. The emphasis will also depend on the strengths and weaknesses of the individual child. Earlier, I mentioned phonological awareness, and phonological awareness is associated with processing phonological information. Students who are identified with dyslexia have difficulty with processing phonological information. Therefore, they have weaknesses in that, and they will need a heavier emphasis on that. Students that have attention deficit or executive function difficulties, they may need more of an emphasis on the metacognition of comprehending as you read. So these are things that we just need to be skilled at identifying. And one of the best things that we can use to help with this is thinking about the stages of reading development, because reading is a process that changes, as I said, as the reader develops and becomes more able and proficient. As you see on this slide, Jean Chall in 1983 wrote about the stages of reading development. Subsequent to Jean Chall's writing about it, Linnea Airy and others talked about phases. It's the same idea, that there is a predictable developmental continuum that all children go through as they go through the process of learning to become proficient readers and writers. And so you see on this slide, I've just shown 3 out of 6 of Jean Chall's reading stages. There's 3, 4, and 5, which is more to do with developing the metacognition and the deep reading, etc. But for the purpose of talking about those developing and struggling readers, we want to know where they are in these first 3 stages. Are they at the pre-reading stage, where they don't even have the alphabetic insight yet, or haven't had it? Or are they at stage 1, where they're starting to figure out that alphabetic principle and they need practice applying it, learning to decode and using those decodable texts that I talked about? Once they're through stage 1 and get into stage 2, they no longer need those decodable texts, and they can read more authentic texts because they're going to be working on building fluency and moving into a stage where we're focusing on the comprehension skills. So this continuum is extremely helpful. Teachers, in order to work with these developing and struggling readers, need to learn how to assess students' profiles. So Louise Spears Swerling wrote a wonderful book that talks about the different profiles, and there being 3 of them: students who have trouble with decoding, right? That's one profile. Students who have trouble with comprehension, that's another profile, and students who have trouble with both. And so we need to know what those profiles are in order to deliver the right instruction. We also use a problem-solving structured literacy approach with students for literacy instruction, again, so that we know exactly what they need through diagnostic data. Teachers also learn how to cultivate a deep knowledge of language so that they will understand its relationship to literacy. It seems so important, so obvious, but unfortunately, most teachers do not learn about the role that language plays in learning to read and write. And finally, teachers need to learn how to motivate and engage those students who have difficulties with learning. We have a nation of diverse learners, and this isn't going to change. We have increasing numbers of English language learners in our country, which means those students may have learned to read in a different language. They need to transfer what they know about reading from that language to English. They need to build their vocabulary knowledge in English. So that is something that our teachers are facing every day. We also have a fairly high percentage of students who are either identified or unidentified who have language learning disabilities, also known as dyslexia, and also students with attention problems. And now in the last year, 10 months, we have students who've been negatively impacted by COVID, who haven't been able to access the curriculum because they have difficulty, especially our young students, understanding how to navigate using a virtual platform and paying attention and just interacting with a teacher. And then we have students from disadvantage who also have difficulty overcoming the obstacles and have suffered instructional loss for lots of reasons. This quote, "The children learn when they are supported with high expectations, quality teaching, deep engagement, and made to feel they are entitled to good schooling. The richer those opportunities, the greater the learning." This is that opportunity gap that I really wanted to focus on today. When these opportunities are denied or diminished, we know that lower achievement is the dire and foreseeable result. Last but not least, I want to talk for just a couple minutes about the reality that you are, if you're a teacher or administrator, that you are in. What's your reality? What reading programs do you use to teach children to read? And what resources and materials do you have to do that work? And big important question: how do those reading programs and the resources align with the research? In many of our urban districts, we have limited resources and materials. Teachers don't get as much professional development because of limited time and resources. So we just really want to think about how our programs and resources are aligning with the research. In closing, I just want to focus your attention on a few big ideas. One is that 88% of students that read poorly at the end of first grade will read poorly at the end of fourth grade. And unless effective reading instruction is provided, students that are reading poorly at the end of fourth grade will have reading difficulties for the rest of their life, and they will have a significant impact as a result. Effective prevention programs demand that we have a shared responsibility and a common language among us. And last but not least, teachers need to learn the science of teaching reading to ensure that all children learn to read to succeed in school and life. I invite you to, we'll have some questions now, but in closing, I want to invite you to come to our first webinar that is going to be devoted to phoneme awareness and phonemic awareness and phonics on February 9th. Our second on comprehension on March 9th. our third on syntax, April 13th, I believe. And our final webinar devoted to vocabulary will be on May 11th. So thank you very much for attending this webinar, and I wish you all the best, and I look forward to some questions now.
Thank you, Margie, so much for this great information. We've had a few questions. The first one, we had one that was sent in ahead that we'd like to address to you. The question is, how does Literacy How's approach fit in with balanced literacy?
So Literacy How really can fit into lots of approaches or programs, because we are not a program. We're not a scripted reading program. Rather, we look at building teachers' knowledge. So when it comes to balanced literacy, for those of you who may not know the term, balanced literacy is really looking comprehensively at reading. So thinking about the comprehension, the importance of comprehension, and including phonics. Oftentimes, balanced literacy has phonics included, but it might not be explicit and systematic. So what Literacy How might do in that case is to explain how a scope and sequence would strengthen the phonics component of reading and complement the focus on comprehension. We also know, as I mentioned, that continuum, that if we think about the students and what stage they're in versus what grade they're in, we'll focus our instruction accordingly, and we'll, instead of doing a guided reading lesson that's focused on comprehension, we could do a guided reading lesson that's focused on developing their automaticity and reading word patterns. So again, it's really understanding the structure of language and how to assess students' knowledge about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question from Christine was asking, can you explain if decodable books are beneficial for struggling high school students who are struggling with dyslexia, who also have low working memory? Part 2 is, could you explain how decodable books help to cement these unfamiliar taught words in the student's long-term memory?
Yeah, that's a two-part question, probably a little complex for right now, but I'll talk a little bit about your first question, because it's a good one. Decodable texts are important if a student is at that stage 1 where they're just figuring out that there is this alphabetic principle and they need practice to develop their accuracy in reading those words and their automaticity so they can be fluent when they read those words and words in sentences, etc. The key is finding good reading material for those high school students. I started teaching 45 years ago, I'm dating myself. There weren't a lot of choices really for decodable texts. And so the decodable texts we used were not the most exciting. Now I'm happy to say there are lots of choices, and there's some really good choices, including choices for high school students. There's a publishing company that publishes High Noon books. They used to be high interest, low vocabulary. Now they publish decodable books that are actually quite interesting, and high school students actually enjoy reading them. So I do believe that it's important for some period of time to give students the practice to develop the automatic word reading that's necessary. As far as the working memory is concerned, working memory really impacts comprehension more than it does the actual word recognition, because we're not asking kids to memorize words. And when you think of flashing sight words for students to memorize words, the message we give them and the way that we teach sight word recognition is, I think, a little misleading for kids and for teachers too, because we don't want kids memorizing words. 85% of our words can be decoded. They're regular words. So we want to teach them how to do that and not give them a message of memorization. So working memory skills impact other aspects of reading, including, like I said, comprehension, not so much with the decoding. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Margie. Next question from our friend Posey. Do you have a successful approach to re-educate or inform preschool teachers who respond to a tool like Haggerty's PA for preschool as developmentally inappropriate?
Another great question. Hi, Posey, from Alaska. It's wonderful that you joined us today. I would say that is a very, very important thing to consider. And as I mentioned, we do work with preschool teachers. We've been working with preschool teachers for many years. And we have a preschool at a children's museum actually in Norwalk, and some other LE classrooms in the Norwalk Public Schools and in Fairfield. And honestly, we've, I think, really had great good fortune with those teachers to help them understand that teaching foundational skills to preschool students is not, you know, and making sure those students are socially and emotionally engaged and enjoying interacting with their peers and playing and having fun. Those things are not mutually exclusive. We just have to keep telling teachers and exposing them to the mounds of research on the importance of developing these early language skills that then parlay into learning to read. And so again, it's a process, but I think you have to just, number one, share the research, but secondly, start collecting some data, and that inspires teachers. When they see what those young children can do, they're amazed. So good luck with that, Posey.
Next question, Margie, from Anne. Can you talk about your ideas about assistive technology for struggling readers, like text to speech, so older kids can get the content as well as learning the skill of reading?
Yeah, well, learning the skill of reading is probably not going to come so much from the technology, but certainly exposure to content is a very important reason for using text to speech and any technology that a student actually will use. And that's something that you have to really student by student investigate. So doing assistive technology eval with each individual student to find out what they will use and enjoy using. Teaching them to read, there's no substitute for actually explicitly teaching some of the things that I talked about today, and that I will talk more about in subsequent webinars. The assistive technology is very important, and I'd say especially for students grade 4 and above, you can start exposing little kids to some of that, but honestly, I think grade 4 and higher is when you really start to shift to using the assistive technology to fill in some of those gaps. And especially giving the students access to the content information that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Thank you, Margie. I think our time is wrapping up. So I will let everyone know that the questions that weren't answered today live, we will take note of them and try to respond to you personally about those questions. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon, or this evening, or early this morning. If you're still here from England, really appreciate your time. And I look forward to seeing you again in February.